So title of the lecture is Haldol Neurotoxic. Haldol, of course, being the brand name, popular brand name for a very old medicine known generically as haloperidol. I got interested in this for two reasons. One, I met a young man a while ago who eventually disclosed to me that he has schizophrenia. He's been treating for schizophrenia. Wouldn't have guessed it because he looked like a completely healthy and well put together person. In the course of our conversation, I learned that he's a business owner. He manages employees, and I was pleased to hear that he had made a very complete recovery from his schizophrenia. And he had been symptomatic with symptoms of psychosis for almost 4 years prior to when he was, at his insistence, prescribed haloperidol. For the previous 4 years, he'd been on many different modern second-generation drugs, and it had not complete relief of symptoms as well as a bunch of side effects that he didn't like. He insisted to his doctor that he be prescribed haloperidol based on the fact that he had been given some haloperidol during one of his hospitalizations, and he thought it worked better. This young man takes a couple of milligrams a day, and it has transformed his life. So it is, for some people, a fabulously good medicine. Then the other thing that leads me to this topic is that several years ago, I started to get many questions from clinicians in the field. Is Haldol neurotoxic? I've heard that Haldol causes brain damage and so forth. And I ultimately traced that to some articles that were published that I'll discuss in this talk today that argue seemingly very strongly that Haldol is neurotoxic, and the author takes it to the point that he suggests because of this well-demonstrated neurotoxicity, we should remove it from the market and never use it again. And that raises some questions. So I want to focus on that, but to come back to haloperidol is a useful drug. It is actually not, modern drugs in terms of effectiveness on average are not superior to haloperidol. Modern drugs don't have the neurological side effects, and by that I mean the extrapyramidal side effects of dystonia and drug-induced Parkinsonism and tardive dyskinesia. They don't have it as much as haloperidol, but the new drugs do still retain those neurological side effects. It's a drug still in use. 1.2 million prescriptions were written in the United States in 2017, and it is an extremely economical drug, which makes it probably more widely used in many other countries in the world. So to bring up the idea that it's neurotoxic is a very significant thing to do. To publish papers with headlines like this, Haldol is clearly neurotoxic, and introduce the idea that it should be banned. For this young man that I mentioned at the beginning who has had his life turned around from haloperidol, if he reads this article, he's likely to be very nervous. He might decide to stop taking it, and then he may risk losing a lot that he's gained. And that if we're going to accept the idea that haloperidol is neurotoxic, we're going to then have to acknowledge the psychiatrists for 40 years have been prescribing brain poison, which isn't going to be doing it's not going to advance the cause of making people less fearful of our treatments or our medicines or reducing the stigma. So if you're going to make claims like that, you should have a lot of really strong evidence. And in this 2013 editorial, by the way, Henry Nasrallah is the editor-in-chief of this journal, so he wrote it in his own journal. But he made reference to 28 studies and wrote in this paper, and I'll write a more complete review article coming up, which he ultimately did. So he published this paper in 2017 in Annals of Clinical Psychiatry, in which he does as he promised. He's going to show us 30 studies that support the haloperidol neurotoxicity. He's going to, in his words, show that it has measurable neurotoxic effects at all doses. And as he did in 2017 article, he didn't say that it should be banned in this piece, but he did say that it should be stopped as a first-line treatment for psychosis. So let's look at the studies. But before we talk about toxicity of Haldol, let's talk about toxicity in general. It's a dirty secret. all drugs are toxic. And in real estate, we say location, location, location. In toxicology or pharmacology, it's concentration, 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 or dose. Almost everything will kill a cell if it's, or a body, if it's given at excessive dosing. So if we're going to consider haloperidol neurotoxicity, we're going to have to spend a few minutes to know what doses or concentrations are clinically relevant and what are not. So what are the clinically relevant concentrations? There are two ways of measuring concentration. The easier one from my mind is to think about it in molar, which is moles per liter, or nanomoles per liter. The other way to do it is in nanograms per gram or milligrams per liter or something like that. So I am, for ease, I'm going to convert, I have converted every concentration unit into nanomolar for this presentation. So we're looking in concentration units of nanomolar. We see that about half of the target D2 receptors are saturated at a dose of about 0.8 nanomolar. We'll call that 1 nanomolar just to keep it simple. So 50% of the target is saturated at about 1 nanomolar, and there's really no further gains when you go beyond 8 nanomolar. So, and that corresponds roughly to a 10 milligram per day dose. You can wind up, if you want to look for the 50% or the 70% target, which many argue is the level of blockade that you need for antipsychotic efficacy, note that you can achieve that level of blockade with just under 5 milligrams oral haloperidol dose. A lot of folks prescribe 10 milligrams per day, and here you're at that part of the curve. So take-home message from this: Ki is 1 nanomolar, saturation is 8 nanomolar, and we'll move on from there. Blood concentrations, lots of studies, lots of numbers. A couple of papers have tried to look at what they think is the optimum dose or the optimum likelihood of a response. And we get a cluster of measures between, say, 5 and 40 nanomolar for blood concentrations associated with clinical relevance. So we were here at, say, 1 nanomolar, here we're now at 20 nanomolar. And now looking at brain. Brain and CSF, we're going to break it into two things. Brain, remember, is mostly composed of fat, and Haldol is very fat soluble. So if you look at the entire brain, you're going to see significantly higher concentrations in the entire brain, which is, again, mostly fat. In one study, there was one patient that had an estimated 600 nanomolar, but everybody else in that study was under 150. Most were clustering around 100. In rats, if you want to give an approximate conversion, then you get up to under 400 nanomolar. Again, brain concentrates it and stores it in fat. That doesn't necessarily equate to the concentration of haloperidol in the synaptic spaces or the extracellular spaces. In other words, most of this is probably not going to be actually interacting with neurons. If we want to try to get some rough estimate of what the relevant concentration is that's free and circulating, we can look to cerebrospinal fluid, and here you see ranges between 3 and 10 nanomolar. So those are the concentrations that matter, and to summarize, you can get 50% of the target occupied at 1 nanomolar, you fully saturate the target at 10 nanomolar, clinically relevant cerebrospinal fluid is around 5, clinically relevant blood levels around 40, and whole brain sticking in a lot of fat gets you to around 400 nanomolar. So these are the numbers that matter. And probably these lower numbers are the ones that are more relevant. But in future, to summarize, now we'll go on to Nasrallah's cited studies. So I'm going to do this fast. Here again is your reference for the concentrations that matter. Here are the concentrations that were actually used in these cell culture in vitro experiments. Obviously, you'll see that if we even use 400 as the top end of relevant, these concentrations are way above what would be considered relevant. And notably, no toxicity was seen at 10,000 nanomolar, no toxicity at 1,000, enhancement of survival at 3,600 nanomolar, no toxicity at up to 1,000 nanomolar, no toxicity at 10,000. Here, where it's blank, they did kill cells at 100,000 or 50,000. So these result in cell death, but the comments are where you don't see cell death. Another slew of studies, again, all cited in the Nasrallah paper as evidence of measurable neurotoxicity. In this study, they didn't even use nerve cells, but they died at 100,000 nanomolar. PC12 cells are they're neural tissue. So it's a fair tissue culture model, but no toxicity at 10,000. And again, 10,000 versus 400 as clinically relevant. No toxicity, no toxicity. And here are some more studies that he cited. Again, really, really high in vitro concentrations. This one resulted in cell death. These cells don't even have D2 receptors, so they had to modify them to have D2 receptors. They died. This one actually showed that haloperidol increases the output of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and here we see no toxicity at 10,000. So no tox, again, similar thing. So to summarize, and no, at 20,000 nanomolar, no evidence of toxicity. So that's that. Let's turn to in vivo studies where they inject rats with haloperidol. Again, let's talk about dosing. 1 milligram per kilogram per day is pretty standard in animal research of haloperidol. An average North American is 80 kilograms. So that would, if we just do a 1-to-1 conversion, would be studying like 80 milligram per day dosing. The argument from, or actually, sorry, it's a fact that rats can have better metabolism of drugs than humans, so the doses probably should be higher. They also, as we'll see, have different volumes of distribution. But the study from Sweden in Arvid Carlson's laboratory showed that a 0.25 milligram per day produces a brain Haldol concentration, which is 400 nanomolar, which is actually a bit above what you see in estimated humans. And 0.75 milligrams per day produces serum levels that are a bit lower, but 1 milligram gives higher. So the bottom line is that 1 milligram per kilogram a day is sort of reasonable. It will give you blood levels which look clinically relevant, but probably gives you brain levels that are higher than clinically relevant just because they're rats and they do things, they're different bodies. So with that explanation, here we look at the in vitro studies that were cited. These are the authors, these are the species, these are the dosing. Weirdly, most of these studies don't actually measure the death of neurons in the brain. So here they looked at biochemical markers which aren't specifically related to toxicity. So in these 4 studies, they simply didn't measure cell death. In these studies, this actually is a measure of cell death, fragmentation of DNA, and it found that at this dose there was no change there was no evidence of toxicity. These 3 studies didn't measure it. This study didn't measure it, and these 2 studies at 0.1 milligram per kilogram per day, and bizarrely, at using decanoate every day at these doses, you did find a DNA fragmentation in this study, and at the lower doses you saw evidence of cell stress, and at the higher doses you saw cell loss. So this is the scorecard of 23 studies that were in vitro with very large doses. First of all, none of them were actually done at clinically relevant concentrations. Most of them, many of them showed no toxicity. One showed that it actually enhances neuronal survival. One showed that it stimulates the release of a neurotrophic factor. Of the rat studies that were cited, most of them didn't even look at cell death. 2 showed cell death and 1 showed not. So that's where you're at with that. Studies that weren't cited, I'm just going to throw out a couple of other pieces of information. Maybe it's not, could it be helpful? So NAA is a thing that you can measure. You can measure it in human beings by putting them into magnetic resonance spectroscopy scanners. And NAA levels, when they're high, they reflect cell viability or health or survival. And when they fall, it's seen as a biomarker of cell death. In actually 2 studies, NAA levels were either not changed by haloperidol or were increased. The Hardy study would suggest that haloperidol actually promotes survival and growth of nerve cells. Meschel and Casey showed that haloperidol stimulates synaptic plasticity, generates more synapses. there was a MRI study showing that phospholipid abnormalities in the temporal lobes are resolving with haloperidol, and another rat study showing that there was no loss of cells, and in fact the cells grew both a bit in size and in diameter of axons. So there are plenty of papers that say that not only might it be not toxic, it may actually be health promoting of brain health. So there's that. So let's ask, because I started to think when I heard these papers, when I heard about these papers, I thought, of all the drugs in the world that we use to treat schizophrenia, why focus just on haloperidol? Why not fluphenazine? Why not perfenazine? Why not chlorpromazine? They all have a roughly similar degree of severe extrapyramidal side effect risk. Why did Haldol get singled out? And then I thought, oh, because it comes with a once-a-month long-acting injection form, and that probably, it has economic value because Haldol Deck in the United States retails for $94. I checked with some colleagues of mine in other countries. You can get one shot of Haldol Deck in 08 for $14 in Nigeria, $9 in Argentina. According to GoodRx, the retail price for Invega Sustenna entry-level dose is $2,000. Actually, competing long-acting modern drugs are $2,000 per month. So clearly, if we could ban haloperidol, then it would be good for the makers of these two products. So also, in line with that hypothesis, just to show I'm not a conspiracy theorist here, go back to that 2013 paper that Nasrallah wrote. You can find it online. I looked at it 2 times this week. Here is the paper in MD Edge, and here are 3 advertisements. Today, you see advertisements for Invega Trinza. On the 5th, I saw 3 advertisements for Invega Sustenna. So there's the evidence. There's some economic advantages. I mean, there's evidence of the economic angle to this. We do require that authors disclose their financial ties, and so in the 2017 paper, Nasrallah did do these disclosures. Notably, he's received grant money, consultant money, and speaking money from the makers of long-acting forms of aripiprazole and from long-acting forms of risperidone and paliperidone. I wish that we would have required journals to actually disclose the amount that you get from each of these people, but we do have a website that does that, so open payments from CMS, and you'll see that the 3 makers, this is the maker of Invega, Sustenna, and Trinza, this is the maker of Abilify Maintaina, this is the maker of Abilify, I'm blanking on the name right now, but the multi-month injection form, and he's clearly gotten, he's a conflicted author in that. So to summarize, haloperidol, all drugs have their benefits and their risks. I have to say, drugs don't know good or bad. They have a mixture of both in them, every single one. Haldol remains an effective medication. It has neurological side effects, specifically the extrapyramidal side effects, including tardive dyskinesia. The likelihood is higher with Haldol than other drugs, but the second-generation drugs have a non-zero risk of the same things. In contrast to second-generation drugs, you do gain from haloperidol significantly less weight or less risk of weight gain, blood sugar complications, and the things that are cardiovascular risk factors. In the evidence that was cited, it's really not compelling to say that we should label it neurotoxic, especially given all this writing with the consequences of coming to that conclusion. And there is considerable potential for conflict of interest in making such claims. Neurotoxicity, there is, as I've shown in some animal data, still some concern that it may be not enhancing neuronal survival, may work against it, may kill cells. At least we see that in some animal studies, but not all. So it's a very good question. I think it deserves probably branching out to species beyond mice and rats, as well as trying to get a clearer idea of what are the brain concentrations that we achieve in these species, and try to correlate animal findings with human findings to get a clear-eyed view of the extent to which haloperidol may be harmful or the extent to which it may be helpful. in brains affected by schizophrenia. And finally, like every other drug, we can reduce all manner of side effect risk by using it at the lowest possible dose. I opened with telling you the story of a young man who's on a couple of milligrams a day. And if you look, especially in first episode literature, you'll find that you can induce remission of psychosis from 2 to 4 milligrams per day of haloperidol. So at these doses, we greatly reduce neurological side effect and probably reduce the risk of anything else. There's no one best drug for everybody. In my practice, it's not my number one choice, but it still is the right medicine for some people. And as I said, we should be careful when we decide to call it toxic and these other sorts of things. So that is the end of those comments.